The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of Margaret Collins's modest home in suburban Philadelphia, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. She stood at the counter, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she held the cream-colored envelope. The return address read, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Blackwell, in elegant calligraphy. Her stomach tightened. Finally, she whispered, carefully sliding her finger under the seal. The invitation was exquisite, embossed gold lettering on thick cardstock that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Together with their families, Victoria Blackwell and Thomas Collins request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony. Margaret's eyes misted as she traced her son's name with her fingertip. Tommy. Her baby boy was getting married. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years of distance and silence, he had included her. She sank into a kitchen chair, memories flooding back. The divorce had been ugly. Richard had used his law firm connections to paint her as an unfit mother, citing her waitressing job and modest apartment as evidence she couldn't provide properly for Tommy. The custody battle had drained her savings, and in the end, Richard's money had won. Tommy was 12 when the judge granted primary custody to his father. The phone rang, startling her from her reverie. The caller ID showed her sister Janet's number. "Did you get it?" Janet asked without preamble. "Yes. Just opened it." "And?" Margaret read the details aloud. Saturday, June 15th, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The Blackwell Estate, Gladwin. Janet whistled low. "The estate? That place is like a castle. Are you going?" "Of course I'm going. He's my son." "Maggie, you know what I mean. It's been 3 years since you've seen him, and Richard will be there with her." Her. Diane Blackwell, the woman Richard had left her for. Now Tommy's stepmother for the past 8 years. The woman who had taken her place at school events, holiday dinners, and birthday celebrations while Margaret watched from afar, reduced to occasional phone calls and birthday cards that went unacknowledged. "I don't care about Richard or Diane. This is about Tommy. What will you wear? You'll need something appropriate for—" "I'll figure it out," Margaret interrupted, though anxiety gnawed at her. The Blackwell estate wasn't just any venue. It was a sprawling property with manicured gardens and a ballroom that had hosted governors and celebrities. Her simple wardrobe of work uniforms and casual clothes suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. That evening, Margaret stood before her closet, pushing through hangers of well-worn clothing. Nothing seemed right. She pulled out her best dress, a navy blue sheath she'd worn to her niece's graduation 5 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but decidedly simple. Would Tommy be embarrassed by her? She spent the next 2 weeks preparing. She had her hair professionally styled for the first time in years, trading her usual ponytail for soft waves that framed her face. She found an elegant dress at a consignment shop, a dusty rose creation that the saleswoman assured her was mother of the groom appropriate. She even splurged on new shoes, though they pinched her feet. The night before the wedding, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed rehearsing what she would say to Tommy. Would he be happy to see her? Would they have a chance to really talk? She had so many questions about his life, his bride, his dreams for the future. Victoria Blackwell. Margaret knew little about her beyond what she'd gleaned from social media. Beautiful, polished, from a wealthy family. Everything Margaret wasn't. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Margaret arrived at the Blackwell estate an hour early, her hands gripping the steering wheel of her 10-year-old Honda as she navigated the winding driveway. The property was even more magnificent than she'd imagined. Acres of emerald lawn stretched toward a Greek Revival mansion, with white columns and perfectly symmetrical windows. A team of workers was setting up rows of white chairs on the lawn, facing an elegant arbor draped with roses and peonies. She parked in the designated area, feeling conspicuous among the luxury vehicles. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her courage and walked toward the venue. A young woman with a clipboard and headset intercepted her. "Good afternoon. You're quite early. Family, I presume?" "Yes, I'm Margaret Collins, the groom's mother." The woman's smile faltered almost imperceptibly as she consulted her clipboard. "Oh, Mrs. Collins. Yes, I see you here." She paused, her pen hovering over the seating chart. "Let me just confirm your seating assignment." Margaret watched as the woman spoke quietly into her headset, catching fragments. "Biological mother. Seating arrangement," Mr. Blackwell said. Her heart sank. Of course Richard would have orchestrated the seating. Of course there would be complications. The coordinator returned, her smile now fixed and professional. "Mrs. Collins, you're in row 5 on the groom's side. Let me show you." "Row 5? Margaret's voice came out smaller than intended. "But I'm his mother." "Yes. Well, the immediate family seating has been arranged by Mr. Blackwell and the bride's family. The first row is for—" She caught herself. "The seating has been carefully planned to accommodate all the family dynamics." Family dynamics? a polite way of saying she'd been relegated to the back while Diane would sit in the front row, in the place where mothers belong. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "I understand. Thank you." She found her assigned seat and sat down, even though the ceremony wouldn't begin for another hour. From the fifth row, she had a clear view of the arbor, but would struggle to see Tommy's face when he stood at the altar. Other guests began arriving, filling in the rows around her. She recognized some of Richard's colleagues, a few of Tommy's childhood friends who had grown into young men she barely recognized. Then she saw him. Tommy emerged from the house, looking impossibly handsome in his dark suit. He was laughing at something his groomsmen said, his face animated and bright. Margaret's breath caught. When had her little boy become this confident young man? He moved through the gathering crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, but his eyes never found hers in the fifth row. Richard appeared next, impeccable in an obviously expensive suit. Diane on his arm in a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than Margaret made in a month. They moved to the front row, settling into their seats with an air of proprietary ownership. This was their domain, their celebration. Margaret watched as the seats filled, as the string quartet began to play, as the wedding party gathered. She sat in her fifth row seat, hands folded in her lap, looking like any other distant relative or family friend. No one would know she had labored for 18 hours to bring the groom into this world, had sung him to sleep with off-key lullabies, had taught him to tie his shoes and ride a bike. The music swelled, and the ceremony was about to begin. Margaret straightened her spine and fixed her eyes on the arbor where her son would soon stand. She had come here for Tommy, and no seating arrangement would diminish that. But as the processional began, a wild idea began to form in her mind. An idea that would either reconnect her with her son or destroy any chance they had at reconciliation. The wedding was about to begin, and Margaret Collins was done being invisible. End of Chapter 1, 6,896 characters. Tentar novamente, gaucaditar. Chapter 2, The Decision. The processional music swelled as the first bridesmaid appeared at the end of the aisle, her lavender dress flowing in the gentle June breeze. Margaret watched from her fifth row seat as one by one, the wedding party made their entrance. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she spotted Tommy taking his place at the altar, his best man at his side. From her distant vantage point, she could barely make out the expression on his face. Was he nervous? Happy? She remembered his first day of kindergarten, how he'd clutched her hand at the classroom door, needing reassurance that she'd be there when school ended. Now he stood tall and assured, a stranger in a familiar face. The music shifted to Pachelbel's canon, and the congregation rose. Victoria appeared at the entrance, a vision in white silk and lace, her father beside her. Even from the fifth row, Margaret could see she was stunning, poised, elegant, everything a Blackwell bride should be. As they proceeded down the aisle, Margaret's view was blocked by the standing guests. She craned her neck, catching glimpses of white between shoulders and elaborate hats. "Please be seated," the officiant announced as Victoria reached the altar. As everyone settled back into their chairs, Margaret noticed the officiant for the first time. Reverend Patricia Whitfield stood between Tommy and Victoria, her warm smile radiating the joy of the occasion. She was a handsome woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Whitfield began, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas Richard Collins and Victoria Marie Blackwell in holy matrimony." Margaret's chest tightened at hearing Tommy's full name. Richard. He'd given their son his middle name, another claim of ownership. She pushed the bitter thought away, focusing on the ceremony. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," the Reverend continued, "not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted. It is a celebration of love, commitment, and family." Family. The word stung. Margaret glanced at the front row where Richard and Diane sat, their positions declaring to everyone present who the real family was. Diane dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, a touching display of maternal emotion that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Reverend Whitfield asked. "Her mother and I do," Victoria's father responded, his voice thick with emotion. He kissed his daughter's cheek before taking his seat in the front row beside his wife. Margaret watched the interplay of families, the Blackwells and the Collins-Blackwell unit, while she sat isolated in the fifth row like a ghost at the feast. A woman beside her leaned over. "Beautiful ceremony, isn't it?" she whispered. "How do you know the couple?" Margaret hesitated. "I'm connected to the groom's family." "Oh, lovely. The Blackwells are such wonderful people. Diane has been like a second mother to that boy." "From what I understand. So nice when blended families work out well." The words were meant kindly, but they cut deep. Margaret managed a tight smile and returned her attention to the altar, where Reverend Whitfield was speaking about the nature of love. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. She had tried not to keep a record of wrongs, the missed birthdays, the unreturned calls, the school events she'd learned about only through social media posts, but the ledger existed whether she acknowledged it or not. As the ceremony progressed, her wild idea from earlier began to take clearer shape. The fifth row was unacceptable. Not for pride's sake, but because she needed Tommy to see her, to know she was there. The years of polite distance, of accepting whatever crumbs Richard allowed, had to end. Thomas and Victoria have written their own vows, Reverend Whitfield announced. Thomas? Margaret leaned forward, straining to hear every word. Victoria, Tommy began, his voice carrying surprising strength. 3 years ago, you walked into that coffee shop where I was cramming for finals, and my whole world shifted. You've taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice we make every day. You've shown me patience when I've been difficult, grace when I've failed, and joy in the simplest moments. His voice cracked slightly. You've helped me understand what family really means. Not just the one we're born into, but the one we choose to create. Today, I choose you. I promise to support your dreams, to stand by you through whatever comes, and to never take for granted the gift of your love. Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. When had her little boy become so eloquent? And that line about family, was it a deliberate exclusion of her, or simply a young man's attempt at profundity? Victoria's vows were equally moving, speaking of Tommy's kindness, his integrity, his ability to make her laugh even on the hardest days. She mentioned how welcomed she'd felt by his family, and Margaret noticed she used the singular, not plural. His family, Richard and Diane. The rings, please, Reverend Whitfield requested. As the best man produced the rings, Margaret made her decision. She would not sit here in the fifth row, invisible and forgotten, while her son got married, but she wouldn't make a scene either. There had to be a middle way, something that honored her need to be present without destroying Tommy's special day. These rings are symbols of the eternal bond you share, Reverend Whitfield said, holding the bands up for all to see. A circle has no beginning and no end, representing the infinite nature of love. As Tommy slipped the ring onto Victoria's finger, Margaret quietly stood and made her way to the aisle. A few heads turned, probably assuming she was heading to the restroom. Instead of walking back toward the house, she moved forward, keeping to the side of the seated area, partially hidden by a large floral arrangement. From this angle, she could see Tommy's face clearly. The joy there was unmistakable, pure and radiant. This was what mattered, his happiness, not her hurt feelings or Richard's power plays. By the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Reverend Whitfield declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride. As Tommy drew Victoria close, Margaret saw movement in her peripheral vision. An elderly woman in the second row was struggling to her feet, apparently overcome by emotion, or perhaps needing assistance. Without thinking, Margaret moved forward. Let me help you, she said softly, taking the woman's elbow. Oh, thank you, dear, the woman whispered. My arthritis. I just needed to stand for a better view. Are you family? Yes, Margaret said simply. I'm Tommy's mother. The woman's eyes widened slightly, taking in Margaret's position at the side rather than in the front row, but she said nothing. As the newlyweds turned to face their guests, Tommy's eyes swept the crowd. They passed over the fifth row where Margaret should have been sitting, a flicker of something, disappointment, relief, crossing his features. Then he saw her, standing beside the elderly woman, partially obscured by flowers but unmistakably present, was his mother. Their eyes met across the distance, 20 feet that might as well have been 20 years. Tommy's step faltered for just a moment. Victoria, radiant in her joy, didn't notice, but Margaret saw the storm of emotions cross her son's face. Surprise, confusion, and something else. Something that might have been longing. Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Whitfield announced joyfully, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Collins. The crowd erupted in applause as the recessional music began. Tommy and Victoria started down the aisle, accepting congratulations and well wishes. As they drew closer to where Margaret stood, she held her breath. For a moment, it seemed Tommy might speak to her, might acknowledge her presence with more than just that complicated look. But Richard appeared at his son's elbow, smoothly guiding the couple toward the photo session, his body language making it clear that Margaret was not to approach. Immediate family photos first, the photographer called out. Parents of the bride and groom, please. Margaret watched as the Blackwells and Richard and Diane arranged themselves around the happy couple. The photographer clicked away, capturing the perfect family portrait that would no doubt grace mantles and social media posts. No one asked where the groom's mother was. No one seemed to notice the woman standing at the edge of the celebration, close enough to see everything, but not truly part of it. "Excuse me," a gentle voice said beside her. Margaret turned to find Reverend Whitfield, her expression kind but curious. "I couldn't help but notice you during the ceremony. You're Thomas's biological mother, aren't you?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "I thought so. You have his eyes." The Reverend glanced toward the photo session, then back at Margaret. "Family dynamics can be so complicated, can't they? Especially at weddings." "I just wanted to see my son get married," Margaret managed. Reverend Whitfield studied her for a moment. "You know, in all my years of performing weddings, I've learned that love finds a way. Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like, and the path isn't what we expected, but love finds a way." She paused. "The reception is about to begin. Will you be attending?" Margaret hadn't thought that far ahead. Would her name even be on the seating chart for the reception? I'm not sure." "Well," Reverend Whitfield said with a small smile, "I'll be sitting at the head table right next to the wedding party. It's traditional for the officiant to be included. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to find me." As the Reverend walked away to join the receiving line, Margaret realized what had just been offered: an ally. Someone who saw her, who recognized her pain and her love for her son. The wild idea that had been forming crystallized into something more concrete. She wouldn't make a scene. She wouldn't ruin Tommy's wedding, but she would not be invisible any longer. And maybe, just maybe, with Reverend Whitfield's subtle support, she could find a way to reclaim her place in her son's life. The cocktail hour was beginning, guests moving toward the mansion for drinks and hors d'oeuvres. Margaret squared her shoulders and followed the crowd. The real test was yet to come. End of Chapter 2, 7,012 characters, Tentar Nova Ment, Gok Editar, Chapter 3, The Reception. The Blackwell Mansion's ballroom took Margaret's breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables dressed in ivory linens and gold accents. Centerpieces of white roses and peonies perfumed the air, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Margaret felt like she'd stepped into a fairy tale, one where she wasn't quite sure of her role. She found the seating chart displayed on an elegant easel near the entrance. Her finger traced down the list until she found it. Margaret Collins, Table 12. She located the table on the provided diagram. It was in the back corner near the service entrance. Of course. Margaret Collins? She turned to find a familiar face. Linda Patterson, one of the few friends from her married days who hadn't chosen sides in the divorce. "Linda, I didn't know you'd be here. Victoria's mother and I are in the same garden club," Linda explained, air kissing Margaret's cheek. "I had no idea that Tommy was..." She trailed off, clearly having noticed Margaret's name placement on the seating chart. "It's complicated," Margaret said simply. Linda's expression softened. "Come on, let's get you a drink before dinner starts." They made their way to the bar, where Margaret ordered a white wine with hands that trembled slightly. The cocktail hour swirled around them, guests laughing, sharing stories, congratulating the happy couple who moved through the crowd like royalty. Margaret caught glimpses of Tommy, watched how he threw his head back when he laughed, a gesture unchanged from boyhood. "He looks happy," Linda observed, following Margaret's gaze. "He does." Margaret took a sip of wine, the cool liquid helping to calm her nerves. "That's what matters." "But you're his mother. You should be..." "Ladies and gentlemen," the wedding coordinator announced, "please find your seats. The bride and groom will be making their entrance shortly." Margaret made her way to Table 12, finding herself seated with distant relatives from Victoria's side and a few plus ones who seemed equally uncertain about their place in the hierarchy. She introduced herself simply as a family friend, avoiding the complications of explaining her true relationship to the groom. The wedding party entered to enthusiastic applause, Tommy and Victoria glowing with newlywed joy. They took their places at the head table, elevated on a small platform where everyone could see them. Margaret noticed Reverend Whitfield seated at the end of the head table, just as she'd mentioned. Richard stood to make the first toast, his confidence filling the room. "When Tommy came to live with us full-time 8 years ago," he began, and Margaret's stomach clenched. "I watched him grow from a boy into the remarkable man standing before us today. Diane and I couldn't be prouder of the person he's become." The casual erasure of her existence, the way Richard claimed credit for Tommy's character, made Margaret's hand tighten on her water glass. But she kept her expression neutral, aware that others at her table might be watching. More toasts followed, the best man's humorous anecdotes, Victoria's sister's tearful tribute to their bond. Then Diane rose, and Margaret braced herself. Tommy, Diane began, her voice honeyed with emotion. From the moment you came into my life, I knew I'd been given a precious gift. Not every woman gets to be a mother to a child she didn't birth, but you made it easy to love you. She dabbed at her eyes. Watching you today, seeing the man you've become fills my heart with such pride. Victoria, welcome to our family. I couldn't have chosen a better daughter-in-law if I'd tried. Applause rippled through the room. Margaret sat frozen, the words, a child she didn't birth, echoing in her mind. The appropriation was complete. Diane had claimed not just the role, but the emotional territory of motherhood. While Margaret sat at table 12 like a stranger, dinner was served, filet mignon with lobster tail, vegetables arranged like artwork on fine china. Margaret pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. The woman beside her made small talk about the beautiful venue, the perfect weather, but Margaret could barely focus on the conversation. As the main course was cleared, she noticed Reverend Whitfield rise from the head table and make her way across the room. To Margaret's surprise, the Reverend stopped at table 12. Mrs. Collins, she said warmly, how are you enjoying the reception? It's lovely, Margaret managed. Everything is beautiful. Reverend Whitfield glanced around the table, then leaned closer. I wondered if you might help me with something. I like to include a special blessing during the reception, something about the joining of families and the power of love to heal old wounds. I usually ask someone from each side to participate. She paused meaningfully. Would you consider being part of it? Margaret's heart raced. What would I need to do? Simply stand with me during the blessing. Perhaps light a candle. It's a small gesture, but symbolically powerful. The Reverend's eyes were kind, but determined. I've already spoken to Victoria's grandmother about representing her family. Does Richard know about this? I've found it sometimes better to seek forgiveness than permission, Reverend Whitfield said with a slight smile. The blessing happens just before the cake cutting. Think about it. As the Reverend returned to her seat, Margaret's tablemate whispered, How do you know Reverend Whitfield? We just met today, Margaret said truthfully, still processing what had just been offered. The evening progressed with traditions. The first dance, the father-daughter dance. Margaret watched Richard guide Victoria across the floor to The Way You Look Tonight, saw the genuine affection between them. When the mother-son dance was announced, Diane rose gracefully and met Tommy on the dance floor. The song was A Song for Mama by Boys II Men. Margaret recognized it immediately. She used to sing it to Tommy when he was little, changing the words to make him giggle. Now Diane swayed with him to their song, and Margaret had to excuse herself from the table. She found refuge in the ladies' room, gripping the marble counter as she fought for composure. Another woman entered, elderly, elegant, with kind eyes behind designer glasses. Are you all right, dear? Margaret straightened, embarrassed. Yes, just weddings always make me emotional. The woman washed her hands slowly, studying Margaret in the mirror. I'm Eleanor Blackwell, Victoria's grandmother. Margaret's chest tightened. Oh, it's nice to meet you. I know who you are, Eleanor said gently. Reverend Whitfield mentioned she'd spoken to you about the blessing. I haven't decided yet if you should do it. Eleanor dried her hands carefully. I've been married 53 years, raised 4 children. I know something about families and the damage pride can do. She paused. I also know Richard Blackwell. He's my son-in-law. Wonderful provider, successful attorney, but he can be controlling, especially when he feels threatened. Margaret blinked in surprise at the unexpected candor. Eleanor continued, Victoria is a good girl with a kind heart. She doesn't know you were relegated to the 5th row in table 12. If she did, she'd be mortified. She adjusted her pearl necklace. Sometimes the universe provides opportunities to correct imbalances. I believe Reverend Whitfield is offering you one. She moved toward the door, then turned back. Your son has your smile, you know. I noticed it during the ceremony, even from where I was sitting. Don't let anyone take that from you. After Eleanor left, Margaret stood alone in the elegant bathroom, her reflection staring back from the gilt-framed mirror. The woman in the glass looked tired, overwhelmed, but there was something else there too, a spark of determination that had been dormant too long. She returned to the ballroom just as the band announced a special moment. Reverend Whitfield stood near the cake table, a microphone in hand. Friends and family, she began, before we witness the cutting of the cake, I'd like to offer a special blessing. In many traditions, weddings are not just about joining 2 people, but about weaving together the fabric of families. Sometimes that fabric has tears or worn places that need mending. Margaret saw Richard's jaw tighten, his eyes scanning the room. I've asked Eleanor Blackwell and Margaret Collins to join me for this blessing, representing the heritage and love that has shaped Victoria and Thomas into the people they are today. A murmur ran through the crowd. Richard half rose from his seat, but Diane placed a restraining hand on his arm. Tommy's expression was unreadable, but Victoria looked curious, and Margaret thought, pleased. This was it. The moment of choice. Margaret could remain at table 12, invisible and safe, or she could stand up and claim her place as Tommy's mother, regardless of the consequences. Eleanor Blackwell was already making her way to the front, moving with quiet dignity. She paused near table 12, extending her hand to Margaret with the encouraging smile. Margaret stood. The walk to the front of the ballroom felt both endless and instant. She was aware of the whispers, the turning heads, Richard's furious glare, but she was also aware of Tommy's eyes on her, wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. Reverend Whitfield handed both women tall white candles. These flames represent the light of family love, sometimes hidden, sometimes distant, but never truly extinguished. As Eleanor and Margaret light these candles together, we acknowledge that love takes many forms, and that families are built not just on blood, but on choice, forgiveness, and grace. Margaret's hand shook slightly as Eleanor helped her light her candle from the flame of the unity candle Tommy and Victoria had lit during the ceremony. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Thomas and Victoria, Reverend Whitfield continued, as you build your new family, may you carry with you the best of what both your families offer. May you have the wisdom to heal old wounds and the courage to choose love over pride. She nodded to Margaret and Eleanor, who together lit a larger candle on the cake table. Let this light remind us that families can be complicated, messy, and imperfect, but they can also be places of redemption and unconditional love. May all who witness this union support not just Tommy and Victoria, but the entire tapestry of family they represent. Amen, Eleanor said firmly, and the word was echoed throughout the room. As Margaret turned to return to her seat, Tommy stood abruptly. For a moment, mother and son faced each other across the space, years of hurt and absence stretching between them like an ocean. Then Tommy stepped down from the head table and walked toward her.